Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau served for 38 years in the United States Navy and forged new territory for women as the first and only woman in a number of capacities. During her service, Admiral Rondeau earned a bachelor's degree in history and social science from Eisenhower College, a master's in comparative government from Georgetown University, and a doctorate in education from Northern Illinois University. Admiral Rondeau's last active duty assignment was as president of the National Defense University, where she was a member of the board of directors of the United States Institute of Peace and served as a Department of Defense liaison to the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Admiral Rondeau was selected as White House Fellow of the Presidency and Congress, Chief of Naval Operations Strategic Studies Group Fellow, and became a permanent member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Currently, she is an executive with IBM's Department of Defense. Admiral Rondeau works and lives by the principle that we have nearly a covenant with others we lead and follow, and believes most deeply that human dignity should guide how we treat each other. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau.
I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Rear Admiral Margaret Kibben today. Admiral Kibben first heard the call to ministry as an 8th grader in Hartsville, Pennsylvania, and after visiting her boyfriend at the United States Naval Academy in high school, she felt a second calling to the military. The boyfriend didn't last, but from that point on, she knew she wanted to be a naval chaplain, a dream that stayed with her as she pursued her bachelor's at the then all-women's Goucher College. She says that if there's a boy she liked, she wouldn't tell him about her ambition, but conversely, if she wanted to ditch a guy, she would, she would tell him she wanted to become a minister, and in her words, he would run like hell. Admiral Kibben realized her goal when she enrolled in the Naval Chaplain Candidate Program while studying at Princeton Theological Seminary, where she received her Master's of Divinity and Doctorate of Ministry. Since then, she has provided ministry to men and women in the armed forces for 27 years, serving domestically and internationally, and in benevolent and combat tours of duty, in places as far-flung as Turkey, Norway, and Afghanistan. Her personal awards include the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the Meritorious Service Medal with 2 gold stars, and the Navy Commendation Medal with 3 gold stars. She is the first woman to serve in her current capacities as Chaplain of the Marine Corps and Deputy Chief of Chaplains of the United States Navy. I speak for everyone when I say we are delighted you're here. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Kibben.
We're not going to sit down because we know that after lunch, this is not the prime time to talk. So we're going to stand up. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here today. This is my 4th time here and my 1st time without being in uniform. So I'm finding this to be kind of a different experience for me, but it also is an honor to be here. In a college that has as its part of its code a commitment to the accountability to community and a dedication to a life of honor. What a great place to be, and Albright is part of that great college. Margaret and I have known each other since 1990, and we met each other.
We grew up together as children.
Yeah. And it is my pleasure. In the past, we've had a panel of a number of women flag officers at panel. I just thought that this was a special moment with Margaret as the chaplain of the Marine Corps and as the deputy as the deputy for the Navy, and she will become the chaplain of the Navy in her next job. She knows that for a fact. She is a tremendous leader, and so it is a pleasure to have her here. I'll talk about that in a little bit more. I want to talk about you a little bit. I understand that you had Larry Rosenwald here yesterday. Is that right? Yeah. Was he good? Yeah. Yeah. Let me recommend a book to you. Dr. Murray and I were talking earlier, and it's a book by Dr. Elizabeth Samet, S-A-M-E-T. I don't remember what her academic credentials were, where she went to school, because I was mentioning the book to Joanne off the top of my head. She wrote a book called A Soldier's Heart. She teaches freshman English and literature at West Point, United States Military Academy. And this book, which you could read in a weekend, is a great book about her experiences in teaching poetry and literature to men and women who are going to go out to the war and combat, and that this began in the start of 2001. And so she has since then heard from those soldiers, both men and women, as they've been in combat, remembering the literature of the Greeks or the poetry of World War I, and coming back to her and telling her what the meaning of life and of what they were experiencing was given greater depth by the literature which they had read in her class as freshmen. So it's S-A-M-E-T, Soldier's Heart. She wrote a really thick, dense book before that. I would not recommend it unless you're going to go into your doctorate in duty and obligation. It's a good book that I enjoyed reading about duty and obligation, but it's a pretty thick piece. This one is a nice piece, so I do recommend it. Okay, we're going to talk about you. How could I even begin to have the chaplain here, the chaplain of the Marine Corps, and in the future the chaplain of the Navy? We do not call her Admiral or General. She prefers to be called Chaplain, because a chaplain has his or her own distinction in the military. Why would that? Why does what she's going to talk about even begin to relate to you? Because I believe fundamentally that ethics start in very small steps. And they start with everything from the politeness and courtesy, the please and thank you give to each other, because that means that if I give you the courtesy and the politeness, then that you matter, and that your dignity matters, and that you matter in the world. So there are small steps that happen. Well, then you build that up to the larger kinds of questions that Margaret is going to talk about, and you will realize that in the experience which she will discuss, and in the kinds of framing that she will give to you, you need to think about it not just as a concept, an intellectual concept. It is intellectual at some level, but in every case, a conversation about ethics must relate to me. Ethics has as its Greek root word the word in Greek that means ether, or the air around us, the environment that we shape around us. And so when ethics happens, it's the kind of environment that we buy into and that we set. And so when Margaret talks about the ethics and the ethics of decision making, both those things relate to us as individuals. The environment that I set and the decisions that I make. Now, whether or not that is here at Albright and Wellesley, or it's in combat in Afghanistan, I want you to think about that and ask great questions at the end of Admiral Kibben's presentation. Margaret, over to you.
Great, thanks. Well, I am truly honored to be here. I am just in awe of your backgrounds and some of the experiences that you all have had already as juniors and seniors here at Wellesley. Having come from an all-women's college, I am particularly keen on the experience that you're having in that plateau. It's a whole new world. I would never have ever called myself a feminist, if you will, at that point, and the fact that it was a women's thing, it wasn't an agenda item for me. I was just petrified about going to college. And to go to college and think that I'd have to worry about what I was wearing to class just freaked me out. So none of us really worried. We wore, you know, what you now have as flannel pants. We had similar things in our day and age. And showing up in curlers or other states of disarray wasn't as important as the learning and the relationships. And Admiral Rondeau asked me this morning, somebody asked me this morning, maybe it was Audrey, asked me if I'm still in touch with some of the folks from my graduating class, and I most definitely am. And it's really been a bonding experience for us. So congratulations on you for choosing Wellesley. What a great opportunity. I'm sure it has been and will be for you. Now, this particular environment in which you find yourself with the Albright lectures is really what this lecture is all about. As I was talking about to the program director in terms of how this all comes together and how it will take place in this week and the weeks to follow, what you are doing really is what I want to talk about. Because if I understand this program correctly, and feel free to stop me if I'm on the wrong tangent, you all come from several different disciplines. You come from several different backgrounds. You run the gamut of political perspective. And then you are split up into groups, and you have to get along well enough with each other to come up with some sort of project at the end of the time. So my point is that as you listen to this particular lecture, what I want you to think about is what you're doing is what I'm trying to talk about. So if you miss anything I say, just at the end of this Albright series, after 3 weeks, you'll say, I get it now. And we'll all be good. So as a naval officer, and more even particularly as a chaplain, and we're assuming that you know what a chaplain is, but I should not assume that. I had the privilege of spending some time with some young high school students. We were working up with the Semper Fi bowl game. They were all American high school football players. And I was brought in there to say the grace before the meal, and I offered to pray with them before the game. And if anybody in particular needed to talk about something, I'd be happy to do so. One kid raised his hand. Well, I was being very delicate about it, and you know, I didn't want to call him out or anything, so I just sort of meandered over to him later, and I said, yeah, what you got? And he says, what's a chaplain? So much for best intentions. A chaplain, for those of you who may or may not know, I am an ordained minister. Specifically, I'm Presbyterian. In the military, we have chaplains from all different faith groups. In fact, we represent over 100 different faith groups in the Navy, to include Muslim, to include Buddhist, and Jewish, and Catholic, and then the 15 billion Protestant denominations that are out there. We provide for our own, so I would be responsible for those who adhere to my particular tenets of faith, but I also facilitate for others. So that if somebody comes to me from a different faith background and says, I would like to be able to worship, it is my responsibility to make that happen where possible. I also counsel. There's an old phrase that says, go tell it to the chaplain. That is to say, nobody else wants to listen, at least somebody might, maybe it'll be the chaplain. And that really ends up being what my job is. I listen to a lot of things, from about the birth of God to the death of the devil. We cover it all. But it really is a matter of just if you needed somebody to talk to and you just don't know where to go. A sailor, a Marine, a Coast Guardsman. Sorry about that. Oh, well, there you go.
So we're just going to put this over here.
And I will dance around it. Well, hello. May I introduce myself? So, in any case, so people will come to me with a wide variety of discussion points. So I really have seen the gamut. And every time I think I've heard it all, fear not, a Marine can always surprise you. But I also do quite a bit of advisement. And that is the advisement of the commander, him or herself, the one who's responsible for the entire unit. So that he or she may want to know, what's the morale of my unit? And because I have been talking to people and I have access to every place within that unit, if it's a ship, I can go to every little cubbyhole and every little corner and every little nook and cranny, and I have access to all those places. And so as a result, I do have a pretty good idea of what the tempo is, what the kind of the temperature and tenor is of that command. I tell the commander about that. But I also talk about things like when we go into other countries, if religion, let me rephrase that, because religion often has such an impact on that particular arena, I have some expertise in religion, and it's my responsibility to talk to the commander about the impact of mission on the impact of religion on the mission. You may have seen from my bio that I spent some time in Afghanistan. It really was a phenomenal experience. I could spend the entire hour and a half on that, and if anybody at any point just raises your hand and says, go there, I'm happy to do it. So, but Afghanistan was good in as much as one of my jobs as advisor was to serve as the advisor to the commander for the entire theater, a 3-star general who was in charge of the entire theater. You may know his name. His name was Eikenberry. He became the ambassador to Afghanistan shortly thereafter. And I was responsible for the religious ministry for our sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen who found themselves in Afghanistan across the country. That was my responsibility. The other responsibility I had is that I was the liaison between that commanding general and the Minister for Religious Affairs and the Hajj. All right, you should be sizing me up right about now. Funny, you look like a small white Christian woman. Why are you the one responsible for being the liaison to the Minister of Hajj, Religious Affairs and the Hajj? Well, it's a remarkable experience for me, but it actually worked wonders. And I'll tell you why in just a second when I tell you about my third responsibility, and that was I was the mentor to the individual, the general, Afghan general, who was responsible for the delivery of religious ministry across the Afghan National Army. So I was essentially, in my role that I'm doing right now, he was doing for the Afghan National Army. And I was his mentor. Again, you're saying, the small white Christian woman thing ain't working for me. But here's the deal. My experience in Afghanistan was that because I was a religious person, there was an immediate credential that I had that my male line officer counterparts did not have. I was a person of faith. Faith is important in Afghanistan. That's the understatement of the day. And because I understood that language, I could communicate at that level. The female thing, so being a Christian was a good thing. There was nothing wrong with that. They respected that. They knew I respected them. They knew enough about chaplains, about the whole provision facilitation thing, that they knew I respected other faith groups. But then the female thing, my experience has been, and actually Michener wrote in one of his novels, it's called Caravans, said something about there being 3 genders in Afghanistan. There was male, there was Afghan female, and there was Western female. I see some smiles, so perhaps it wasn't such a novel idea. Maybe it's a real thing. But it was my experience, actually, because there was dialogue that could take place between the Afghan men and me because I was not an Afghan woman. I did not belong to another Afghan man. And oh, by the way, I was wearing a uniform, which they understood, and they understood the rank, and they understood the position. So there was a rapport there. It was a very natural rapport. And oh, by the way, the Afghan National Army is responsible for the families. And in particular, this Brigadier General was responsible for the ministry to these families, wives and widows, and their children. Well, here's an Afghan male who's responsible for Afghan women, and he has no liaison. So who became the liaison? It worked on my behalf to be a woman, on the Afghan National Army's behalf, on the United States and their impact in Afghanistan, that I was a woman. It opened doors that others would not have had an opportunity to see. So I did get to see both sides of the fence. I will tell you one other little anecdote, and that was that my translator, wonderful young man, somewhere around 21, because they all falsify their birth dates, he was my translator. So here is this Afghan Muslim who's having to translate for me in front of these hundreds of Afghan soldiers, my little speech, right? And you can imagine what's going through their head. Or maybe you can't because none of you have minds that filthy. But or maybe, all right, maybe you do. So here is this young man who was as devout a Muslim as I am a Christian. And he is having to translate in front of Afghan soldiers and this kind of puts him in a lesser position, for a woman, a white American Christian woman. Pretty awkward position for him to be in. And in fact, found himself beaten up more than once on his way home for helping out Americans. And one can only wonder whether it was also because he was translating for me. But he brought me home to his house. And I sat in the living room with the men. And I also got to go in the kitchen with the women. I saw the whole thing. It was way cool. It was nothing short of way cool. But it was an experience that I really cherish, and it has to do with the fact that was assigned as a Navy chaplain in that particular role. I share that story with you for a couple reasons. One, because they're all really cool stories, and I told you I have plenty more. But I also share it with you because it helped me to sort of frame what it is we are trying to do as individuals, as a country, and in my case, as a service, as a representative of that country. But what we need to be doing diplomatically, and that is to understand the culture, to understand the differences within that culture, and find points of connection. So that once the point of connection is found, then the differences that surround those points of connection can become discussion points and not points of argument. That they can become part of the context and not part of the challenge. That's really what I want to kind of head down here. With respect to ethics, I think it's really particularly important. Bless you. Now, I've indicated, and you already now know, I'm a Navy chaplain. I am not an ethicist. I'd like to say I played one on TV, but I didn't. And I didn't sleep in a Holiday Inn last night either. It's the Marriott tonight. But what I am, however, is one who makes ethical decisions on a daily basis. And you're saying, well, of course you are. You're an admiral in the Navy. Of course you should make ethical decisions. In fact, the fellow who was here with the princess, I mean, he heard what we were talking about, and he just went down this whole lecture about, it was a great lecture, actually. I wish I'd given it myself, about how the military has such a role to play in ethical and moral decision-making at such a totally different plane. But that's not what it's here, and that's what I'm not here about. I'm not here about that. What I'm here about is that we make ethical decisions every day. And in making ethical decisions, we need to be aware of the entire context of that decision, no matter in which arena you find yourself making that decision. So, for instance, I would believe that you also make ethical decisions on a daily basis. And you're saying, no, I'm a student. I don't do that. I go to class. I don't make ethical decisions. Okay, so what happens when the traffic light turns yellow? All right, I want a show of hands. How many of you... Okay, and because I'm a confession, I take confessions, all right? So what is said here stays here. It's kind of Las Vegas, all right? Like Las Vegas? So when you come to a yellow light, how many of you slow to a stop? Okay? How many of you, 9 times out of 10, I'll give you some leeway, race right through it? Okay? How many of you, if even only in a split second, think about what's on the other side of that intersection? A hot date, an important meeting, okay? And that's what helps you make your decision. Anybody there? Okay? How many of you, maybe for a split second, think about the impact, no pun intended, of running the traffic light? You think about the traffic flow, you think about whether there's a car following too closely behind you, and that is what actually helps you make your decision. Okay? And feel free to answer 5 times if you'd like. It's all right. How many of you don't ever make that decision because you don't own a car? So, and how many of you really don't care about the question? Don't answer that. The question about a yellow traffic light, it seems relatively mundane, doesn't it? But in and of itself, opens up the very issues that are related to ethical decision making. Now remember, I indicated that I'm not an ethicist, so I'm not going to try to put labels on these like ontological, I even have to write this down because I don't have them in my head, ontological, teleological, deontological, or situational ethics. I'm not going to go down those roads. However, if that's wet your whistle, I'm sure there's an introduction to ethics class that you can take sometime between now and when you graduate. But suffice it to say, when people make decisions, some believe in an absolute right and wrong, i.e., there is no yellow light. Okay? Others believe that the rules, though important, don't always need to be followed. Notice I'm not taking hands Up on this one? Others take a sort of in-between stance. It depends on the factors influencing the situation. Others are on the constant lookout for the consequences of their decisions and frame their choices accordingly. And finally, others only weigh in when it has a direct impact on their lives. Ethics 101. Feel free to skip the class. But that's ethics as it relates to a traffic light. What about ethics on a broader scale? What about subjects like, and you knew this was coming, serving on an all-volunteer force? Why do some choose to serve in the military, and why do some choose very specifically not to? And what if we were to discuss the gulf between those who choose and those who choose to serve and those who would rather do anything else but serve in the all-volunteer force? In other words, what if we talk about those for whom that everything sort of slows? Do we slow to a stop when we come to this discussion, or do we race right through it? Or maybe we talk about things like what's on the other side of the intersection. For instance, what if we were to talk about the related increased parochial conservatism of some military members, most military members, and its decreased diversity, decreased diversity, demographically, intellectually, socioeconomically, which now creates an us-them gap between those who serve in the military and those who don't. See what I mean? Now we realize there's a context to that decision about whether there should be an all-volunteer force or not. There are a lot of elements to this. This has texture to it that maybe the yellow light scenario didn't provide us. But that's really just making a decision, isn't it? For instance, well, I'll come back to that. But ethics, when it comes to ethics, and we have all come to these discussions so far, whether it's the yellow light, the all-volunteer force, we come to these decisions with opinions. Every one of us has an opinion about these and several other subjects that come up. But our opinions sometimes become our governing factor. We oftentimes get entrenched in our own opinions when we come to that point of decision making. If we have an opinion that is always right or wrong, if we have an opinion that the rules don't apply, if we're driven by the concern about consequences, all these things play a factor in ethical decision making and not just decision making as a whole. I'm going to ask you then, as part of our time here today, and this is how it applies to your overall experience here at Albright, is I want you to think about ethical decision making in terms of critical thinking. Some of you may have been exposed to this thought of critical thinking already. I want you to think critically, given the fact that you've got a 2, 3, this, by the way, is Tavis Long. Forgive me for not introducing him. The good-looking one in the group is Tavis Long. He's my aide, if you will. It's really cool to have an aide. You all ought to strive for having one. He is also a chaplain, married, with 3 children, and represents a faith group that does not ordain women, and yet we serve together. A true example of how the military, and particularly the Navy Chaplain Corps, does things. Okay, but so back to where we were. So we are here as representatives of the military, not to say, come to our way of thinking, but because we as leaders within the military have come to discover that critical thinking plays a huge part in making ethical and moral decisions. Whether it was an ethical or moral decision for us to come into the service or not is not the question. But now that or maybe that's part of a question, but while we are in the military, as we are in the military, we have had to we are responsible for making some decisions that have ethical and moral consequences, have ethical and moral factors to them. And if we come into the military with a myopic perspective on how I see things, then we will run the risk of becoming heterogeneous in our discussions. We will gather up into group think as we come into decision making. And some of you in the civilian community are saying, uh-huh. And if you come from a church background, you might be saying amen. But the point is that we recognize in the military that it is important to think a decision through from all aspects. And that's why I'm here. So what I'd like to ask you to think about is this idea of critical thinking. There's a fellow by the name of Benjamin Coleman, Kohlmann. He wrote a piece on disruptive thinking. I haven't read the whole piece, but I gleaned a couple things out of it for you. And I'm going to ask you, and oh, by the way, before I even ask this, no, I'll say it later. I'm really not this scatterbrained. It's just everything sort of happens all at once. I get so enthusiastic that I talk too fast and 5 phrases come in my head. So how many of you have a smartphone? Yep. Okay, that's what I thought. And I will tell you, this is what I was going to say earlier. It's the first time, Audrey, that I have ever been introduced by someone who is reading their notes off their iPhone. That was way cool. Okay. So, but the real question is, how many of you use your smartphone just for making phone calls? Just phone calls, okay? How many use it for Facebook, Instagram, surfing the web, okay? All right, different subject. How many of you know what a want ad is? A want ad, okay? That's what I was afraid of. How many of you have thought about getting your next job by getting an account with LinkedIn? All right. What Benjamin Coleman's premise is that strategic thinkers, and I would then add decision makers, moral and ethical decision makers, have to think beyond the first order. A smartphone is not smart because it makes telephone calls. A smartphone is smart because it has a second and third order effect. You can socialize on Facebook. You can make really cool pictures out of Instagram. You can search the web. You can use it for your GPS. It's got a host of other things. What good would the smartphone be to you if all you used it for, present company accepted, was for making phone calls? You're missing some parts of that, the value of that. Do you see what I'm saying? You build a network when you use it for more than just making phone calls. Some of you might want to get with her later. And
I need help.
It was a Christmas present. She just got it.
How did you know that?
Did I tell you I was a prophet too? With the want ad question, a want ad, for those of you who are clueless as to that, it's what you find in a newspaper. Are you familiar with a newspaper? In the back of the newspaper, there are these really small blocks with really tiny writing. It's not just for finding men, okay? You can actually find jobs or houses or places to rent. But a want ad used to be the one place you would go to look for a job. Back when I was young, that's where you look. But now everybody thinks in terms of networks. Who do you know? Who does what you do? I mean, already today I saw several people talking to Admiral Rondeau because she is a leader in her field. And you want to get to know a person like Admiral Rondeau because she knows things that you don't. And you've grasped that, and then you connect with each other. You may have never met some of the people you're here with this week. You've now created a new network. You now look out for each other. You've just taken to the second and third order effect. The first effect, I need a job. I'm going to look for someone who wants me. That's the first order. The second and third order effect is you have to be able to look to see if there's something beyond you. All right, I'm going to get to the ethical decision making in a minute. Come with me, stay with me, all right? So when I think in terms, just in terms of And it's appropriate for me to do that because I'm a chaplain. When you think in terms of ethical and moral decision making, why wouldn't you do the same thing? Why wouldn't you go beyond the first order effect? So for instance, if I'm going to make a decision, whatever it is, a moral or ethical decision, why would I rely simply on my instant thought on it? Why wouldn't I? Because that's just like going just to the want ads to find a job, right? Why wouldn't I go beyond that and say, wait a minute, what are some of the other elements to this? What's the real situation here? How do I better understand the entire environment so that I can make a better and more moral or ethical decision, right? So that's what I'm going to get into with respect to critical thinking. I want you to think in terms of moral and ethical decision making, whether you're talking about an immediate moment, whether you're talking about it, whether as leaders, as you go beyond this, as leaders here within the college, and as you become leaders out in the civilian community, in the public sector, or the military community if I've recruited you, is I want you to think in terms of going beyond what is immediately in front of you and what you've always done, or your normal course of doing things. I want you to think critically. So that, to follow another person who studied this idea of critical thinking more clearly, Diane Halpern, Halpern. Critical thinking is purposeful, reasoned, and goal-directed. So you're not just thinking about thinking. You're thinking with a goal. You're not just going to go and think good thoughts. You know, wouldn't it be great to make a decision at some point in the century? You really have an intent to come to a decision, like your projects right now. You may be in the point where you're sort of figuring it out, you know, what are the elements to your project, but you have a goal in mind if it's only graduation. You know, your goal is, I hope, to complete the project most effectively, one would think. So, it's deliberate, it's conscious, and it's an appropriate application of reflective skepticism. I love that, particularly since the military is made up of skeptics. And you, in the bright-eyedness of your life here at the college, do not know what skepticism is. All right, maybe you do. The point is, there's a value to being skeptical, and this is an opportunity for that. So let's talk about making a moral or ethical decision and applying critical thinking to the process. Let's say that you're debating whether to bag studying for your next exam. Okay? So let's think about what your concern is. And there could be, this is because it's a made-up situation, there's a whole host of things that you could just make up. I'm not, okay, so think about, I know you all are exceptional students and you would never think of bagging an exam. So you think about the dirtbag who lives down the hall and you think about them when they, you know, so put yourself in their position. All right. What are the factors about making a decision whether to skip an exam? I realize bag may not be maybe it's an old word. You're not going to take the exam. You're not going to study for the exam. Not take it, but you're not going to study for it. What are the factors for that?
Can you make it up later?
Can you make it up later?
How prepared you are right now without studying?
Right. How prepared you are right now.
The consequence of not studying, like if you fail that exam, what's the consequence of the entire grade?
What would be the impact on the grade? You know, my 15-year-old daughter does that to me. Oh, it's not a big deal because it's only worth 5% of the grade. What? Okay.
Whether or not the professor would notice.
Would the professor notice? I like that. It's like writing a whole paper and you just say Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse through the whole thing. You know? Got it.
The opportunity cost of your time, so if you'd rather be doing other things that are more valuable to you.
Exactly. If there's other reasons for your time,
Would you be judged for doing less than you could?
would you be judged for doing less than you could? Great points. Okay, so now, what would be, you've just identified your presumed points of view. What would be some other points of view related to skipping an exam? Skipping studying for exam.
What is the point of studying for this exam?
What is the point of studying for this exam? Okay?
Maybe your teacher's time to teach you the material which you're then not valuing enough to review.
Great, you haven't valued the professor's time, the teacher's time.
Someone's essentially paying
Okay, so there's money associated with this.
Maybe you feel the material on the exam is not necessarily correlated to your long-term career goals.
Right, what good is this to me ultimately? Okay, great. So in looking at that critically, what you've done is you come in with your sort of first choice, your overall perspective on what it would mean to skip studying for the exam. You've identified a few other points of view, okay? And then some assumptions that you bring to the table. Some of you actually have raised some of those already. It's not going to impact my grade. The other things I have to do are more important, or my parents are paying for this, they're going to kill me. You know, those are assumptions that you're bringing to the table. And then some other facts, which you may or may not have considered because it just kind of blew your thought. Some other thoughts might be, this exam, you don't know this, but could it be the pivotal point of your getting that job 2 years down the line? That might be another fact. Or it may be that every other junior in Wellesley bagged studying for that exam, so on a historical basis, so it's actually the easiest exam other facts are involved with it. This metaphor is kind of going down the hill real fast, but it gives you an idea in terms of the elements of critical thinking. There is, in fact, the concern. There are other points of view. There are assumptions that you bring to the table. And there are other facts that you may or may not be aware of when coming to that point of making a decision. And then there is the implication. Somebody said already, well, this could cost me my grade. What are the implications of not studying for this exam? You give that some thought too. This is where the metaphor sort of falls apart because we've already sort of talked about some of these implications. So, since you're smart people and you all study for your exams, let's skip the metaphor and let's go to something a little bit more weighty. Let's talk about this decision about whether women should be in combat. So, the issue is that a federal lawsuit was filed in San Francisco which challenges the Pentagon's long-standing policy barring women from serving in direct combat positions. All right? The issues include that the current policy, the 1994 Combat Exclusion Policy, bars women from being assigned to ground combat units. That means in the ground, in the dirt, straight on enemy, face-to-face. Ground combat units which are smaller and considered more dangerous because they are often in the thick of battle for longer periods than the other units. They tend to be a smaller unit. It would be the infantry, if you're familiar with that kind of context. It would be the smaller, way out in the middle of nowhere folks, as opposed to the large division that might come in because there are women serving in some of those positions. So let me ask you, what are your points of view with respect to women in combat? With just a couple lines, because I realize this has some volume to it. Your perspectives on women serving in combat units, in direct combat.
One of the major components of this issue, in my understanding from political science background interested in the military, is that the Lioness unit that was on the ground in Afghanistan.
Iraq.
In Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
I had read these.
Lioness is with Iraq, and then Female Engagement Team with Afghanistan.
Yes, it was the FUTs
Mm-hmm.
in Afghanistan. Showed that the front lines are much less clear now. So while they were being kept at what was supposed to be a more minimally combative front line, when they were running patrols, they could be attacked at any moment. So the nature of wars and engagement is changing.
Right. Okay. And how about your opinion on women in combat?
My opinion is that if women can prove to be physically capable of the type of strain that it puts under them and can provide the same leadership as male Marines, I don't see what the problem is.
Okay. So
and I'm for it.
Okay. Good. So you're open to the idea as long as they are physically capable and demonstrate the same leadership qualities. Okay. Who else? Ma'am.
Okay, hi, my name is Christine. I'd like to, so while this does not reflect my own personal views, I'd like to give an argument that against women in combat. It's just that, maybe even still today in the military, there may be people who, because I feel like if you're on the front lines of the military, trust is a huge factor. And
Trust, okay.
you must trust the people you're fighting alongside with. So if you have women on the front lines and you're somebody who doesn't trust in their abilities, that could not only endanger the lives of the person you're fighting with, but also yourself. So,
Okay, why would a woman not be trustworthy?
because you may believe that they are not strong enough.
Okay, got it. Perfect. 2 down from you.
Hello. My name is Emma. And just in response to that, I think that's sort of a difficult path to go down. Because what if you're a person who doesn't trust Muslims? What if you're a person who doesn't trust people with red hair? And so I can't serve with any of those. I think that's sort of an exclusionary method that I
Homosexuals?
don't think can be, right, I don't think that can be applied across the board.
Okay. But what's your opinion?
I don't think that any particular group can be barred from service,
Okay.
but I don't necessarily think that, I mean, I understand the physical differences between, like, genetically between men and women, and so I understand that there are physical costs to women serving in the military, but at the same time, I think it's an ethical problem for women to be barred from military service.
Great.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a quick question about this law. What was this regulation?
What is the combat exclusionary law?
No, like what was the basis for passing this law? Was it because people believed that it was the physical limitations of women, so that therefore they created this law, or?
That's a great question. In the mid-'80s, we weren't allowed on ships, for instance. And then they realized that, well, we could be on ships, but we couldn't be on combatant ships. So they let the rope out a little further, and they said, okay, well, you can go in combatant ships and some combat units, but not direct combat. So the 1994 law was sort of the threshold to which they'd let us be. It wasn't as if we were before and then we couldn't. It was really kind of letting us get to that point.
Hi, my name is Farheen. So when you ask us for our opinion, aren't you in a way giving us the power to comment on something we may or may not know about? So, I mean, I don't have an opinion because I don't think I'm in a position to make a statement on this. And I was wondering if you could speak, so when we talk about ethical decision making, is it valid for us to have opinions on things we don't know much about?
I love you, and you probably don't own a car either, so that you didn't care about the traffic light. You know, that's exactly a great point, because there are some people who are being asked to be part of the collective dialogue, and yet they have no framework on which to base an opinion. That's a great point. And so maybe in this particular situation, there's nothing for you to offer. However, I would suggest that, let's go back to what you're doing overall here in the Albright Institute. In your project, you have an opinion. And it may be different from the other members of your group. But you have to acknowledge the fact that we're coming in with an opinion, generally. Okay? So great point. Great point. Thank you for clarifying that. Anybody else? Any other opinions? I've not heard any particularly against. Nora? There's one right behind you.
Again, I'm going to espouse something that's not my personal opinion, but that I've heard, which is that women could prove to be a distraction to the men. And going off of that, something that is my own personal concern, I guess, with this issue, is that there's already such a high instance of rape in the military, and that obviously affects women who do serve, regardless of whether they're on the front lines or not. So I do think that is something personally that I would say makes me think that maybe that it's a conversation that needs to be had.
Great, good, excellent point, and we'll raise that in a bit.
My name is Prerna, and I just want to piggyback off of what both Farheen and Nora said, and I think that it's really important, as I'm sitting here myself thinking about this, to think about why people have an issue with women in the military in combative roles for those individuals who do, because I think that it an important ethical consideration is, why are we, it comes back to that idea of intent that you said, like, is it because we're looking out for the interests of the women? Is it because we're looking out for the potential impacts on the armed forces themselves? Like, what is the reasoning behind it? And I think that a person who doesn't understand the reasons behind a certain position is not necessarily in a good place to comment on it, because I may say to myself that, oh, you know, I think women should be allowed to serve in combative roles because it's their decision, but then someone else who has more knowledge may be able to come back and say, oh, well, it has these other effects, which kind of balance that out. So I think that it's important in making any sort of ethical decision to try and have a more complete viewpoint than I personally do on this issue.
That's great. We'll go for Anna in the back first.
So, hi, my name is Anna, and going off of Prana's question or answer, I think it's also important to actually ask the soldiers themselves how they would feel about having women fight alongside of them, because that's why I can't really come up with an argument, because I would never be put in such a situation, so I wouldn't really know how I would feel about having another woman with me. I mean, I'm a woman, so I already have biased opinions, so I think it's important to also ask the people that are going to be directly affected by these kind of policies, like, how would you feel if women were allowed to fight with you alongside?
Great, good. And oh, by the way, we all have biases. Let's go with Laura.
Hello, I'm Laura, and it's interesting because when I frame this question in my mind, it does not manifest as an ethical question, but rather as a practical one. When I think about it, of course, women equal rights with men, but the concerns that I would have, which it sounds like a lot of people have talked about, are the practical ones, maybe the rape aspect, maybe physical abilities, maybe trust. And so in my mind, the line should not be drawn by gender, but rather by these practical distinctions that people have talked about.
Okay. So you can send it back here, and then we'll get over to you. Okay, why don't you send one back to the young woman back there, and then you go next.
Hi, I don't want to stir up any, feminist attacks here, but I just feel like it's not going to be a fair fight if you're putting women directly in the combat lines when it's dominated by males. Okay. I know we're strong wills of women and we can do everything, but I just feel like putting women and men, maybe if they put like a different, all women team against all women team, women and women, but I just don't.
It's not flag football, is what you're saying.
But I just don't think women should be fighting with men.
All right, so the opinion is I don't think women should be fighting alongside men.
Yeah, I don't have one specific opinion kind of going off of what Farheen said, because I feel like I don't have a lot of the background knowledge, but something that I think in making decisions that we sometimes forget when we talk about context is why has it taken this long to come to this decision, or why is this question coming now versus in the past? So what social factors are making this question relevant now versus earlier? Why haven't we done this before? So in considering the history of the military. Okay. So that's something that I think is really relevant and may be forgotten in these questions that feel very here and now.
Yes, excellent. Did you want to say something? Okay. What you've done is absolutely exactly where I wanted to go. I don't want you to make a decision on whether women should be in combat or not. I want to talk about the process, though, of coming to a conclusion, to coming to an answer for that. And you have highlighted every one of those elements to it. And at the interest of time, I was going to show you a video on the female engagement teams just to kind of give you a feel for real. Yeah, let's do it anyway. Yeah. If we can throw that up there. But the point is, while she's setting that up, you have talked about everything that has to do with critical thinking as you come to a decision, moral and ethical decision included. So let me just show this one more piece so that you can get some real life perspective.
We're actually changing people's lives. We actually have a hand in what's going on over there, and we can do great things.
The female engagement team is about a company size, and what we do is we go out with battalions of males out into Helmand Province, Afghanistan, and we engage with the community.
They create relationships with the women in Afghanistan, and they're an important part of it. And we've never heard the voice before of the women in Afghanistan.
Because of the culture over there, our men are only allowed to talk to 49% of the population. And as women, we're allowed to talk to the other 51%.
The biggest difference in concept that we have is that we can go beyond, the compounds and inside and talk to these women, without any barriers.
The FET line has changed the role of women by getting them outside, getting them interacting with the populace.
I don't like to be considered anything different. The Marine's a Marine. But we are still able to do something by cultural aspects in Afghanistan that males aren't able to do.
They help women with the things like all American women are concerned about. They do a lot of health care. They help women start businesses so that they become independent. They help with schools and education.
Starting a school from scratch, you think, oh, you need a teacher in a building. There's so much more you need to do when you do that, and our teams help to facilitate that. And we get the district governor, the district community council, we get them involved in it, and they take pride in it. And all they have is a notebook and a teacher saying their alphabet, and they go every day and they want to learn.
Went into the city of Raqqa. We took an English-speaking doctor who was actually born in Iraq but had lived in France, and we brought her back into the country and secured a hospital for her. She came in and provides some basic medical care, some basic hygiene for the women and children to try and let them know that these are some things that we can do for you.
This is every day you're trying to build up, this country that's war-torn, and women's rights are not even acknowledged in the case of even being seen.
We kind of found this hidden talent that we didn't know we had before, so it's kind of a big deal.
These women are a whole new generation of pioneers. This is something that really we've not seen before in the military.
Afghanistan's not the only place we can use it. There's other places where cultural sensitivity matters.
You get a bunch of women in the same room, no matter what country you're from, and you're going to talk about things. And you're going to get that different story that a male soldier talking to a male leader in that village is not going to give you.
It's a very big step for women in all military branches.
It is everything I ever wanted when I joined. I love being a part of the FETs, and I train them now.
I got to looking at a lot of the pictures, and there was this one little boy, and he had put his head on my medical pack, and he's just laying there like this, and it's just, that they looked up to us at that moment. They knew that we were there to do good things for them.
Share that video with you because it is a direct perspective on this, but it also adds to the dialogue. The whole purpose of our discussion here was to talk about not whether women or not should be in combat or not, but I really wanted to talk a little bit about the process of coming to a decision, and you have raised exactly the issues that are part of that. The first thing I asked you to do is what your opinion was. You were very forthright in sharing that. The second thing I asked you to talk about is a little bit about what some of the other points, well, you didn't quite, but you raised it yourselves, what some of the other points of view are. And some of you even raised what the facts are, the sexual assault being one of them. What you didn't raise is that, and then you also raised the fact that the lines of combat have blurred. The female engagement team that you see here doesn't demonstrate quite how blurry the combat lines are. But what you don't know is to get into that village, she is in full battle rattle. She's got the whole gear on, and she's walking in there with a squad of men, other Marines, escorting her in there. And oh, by the way, if there's ever a call, she's geared right back up and she's out. And because she does have this relationship with the women know where some of these improvised explosive devices are. They know where the Taliban has been functioning, and they've been giving them intel on some of these things, and the intel may be immediate. Oh, you don't want to be here today. And now all of a sudden, now we're in combat. What you don't know is that one of the ribbons on one of the first women who spoke, the sergeant who spoke, was a combat action ribbon. That means she has been in a combat action. She was on the front line, okay, being fired at and firing back. So you talked about the opinions, you talked about some of the elements to it. The facts that other things that you want to be aware of are 144 Female troops have been killed, and more than 860 have been wounded in Iraq and Afghanistan. Roughly 20,000 of the 205,000 women who are serving in Afghanistan right now are women. And 15% of 1.4 million Americans on active duty are women. Those are facts that are part of this equation too. So when coming to this piece, the other issue that was raised is, I don't know what I don't know. And so some of the other context to this is, what can the American public stomach? Can we stomach the fact, we haven't broadcast this, the number of women who have died in combat? We haven't talked about that. We talked a little bit about the discomfort that men feel, perhaps, of being alongside a woman, whether sexually or whether it's just by virtue of trusting in their ability. We talked a little bit about that. But we haven't talked about the American will, which also plays a part in this. Okay, so where am I going with this? Do we put women in combat or not? I don't want you to answer that question. What I want you to do when you reflect back on this particular session is, I want you to think about some of the decisions, ethical decisions that you have made and or have to make, and I want you to think about all those layers to it. Your opinion. You are naturally going to come into a decision with your opinion. It may be an uninformed opinion, but it's an opinion. You're going to discover that there are other people who have to play a part in that same ethical decision-making process. You're going to also want to know the facts, the things that you don't know. The elements, both the short term, because that was the here and now question, as well as the long term. And then what we haven't talked about in this particular scenario is, what are the implications of that decision that's being made? So when you think about women who are in combat, you want to think about, what does a woman's PTSD look like, post-traumatic stress disorder look like? And oh, by the way, they're discovering it's different. In the VA hospitals that I visited, it's different. What does it do to a woman physically over a long period of time, because the bone structure is smaller? Does osteoporosis, play a factor here, because women are built differently? So there's a long-term factor to this. The ethical and moral decision-making piece to this may be a little gray, and I appreciate that you're calling me on that, but there is some ethical and decision-making here, because the American public looks at women differently than they do men who are in uniform. So my point is, let's talk a little bit about, let's have some question and answer about, not necessarily women in combat, but I'm willing to go there. But let's talk about some of the moral and ethical decisions you see being made, and how critical thinking, as we've sort of outlined it here, would benefit. This kind of skeptical review would inform an ethical or moral decision. And if you have a better scenario you'd like to play with, we can certainly go down that road as well. So let's open the floor to questions.
I found your speech just brilliant. Oh, sure. My name is Shu Yu, and thank you very much. I really, really loved your speech.
Thank you.
It's one of the best I've ever heard. Maybe some better will come, but thank you.
Lord willing.
So you raised the point about being skeptical. And I'm imagining that if I'm a soldier in the army, and I'm just skeptical about this whole purpose of being engaged in the warfare, and especially your role as a chaplain, because a lot of what people do in the war is against the basic value of religion, like being love, and just no one should kill other people, I guess. Right. So if I'm a soldier like this and I come to you, obviously like what I'm thinking right now will prevent me from being a very efficient soldier. So how would you convince me, or how would you advise me?
Marvelous question. Okay, so here is a moral and ethical dilemma. I do not believe in warfare. I think there is benefit to having had warfare, but would I be a warfighter personally? No. Admiral Rondeau has used the phrase that none of us in uniform are warfighters. It's the American public who has recognized that war may be the only decision that's been made, and you have commissioned us to go forward in doing so. But your point is a little bit more personal. Suppose you, Private Shu Yu, you come to me and you say, I don't know what I was thinking. I was drunk when I went down to the recruiter, and here I am in the middle of combat, and I remember what my Baptist mother said, and she said, I shouldn't kill, right? My response to that to Private Shuyu would be, and remember, my role is to provide, facilitate, care, and advise, is to really to help you, Private Shuyu, determine what is your moral framework, and to help you to articulate that, and to help you have a better foundation for making whatever decision, including whether to stay in the service, what kind of grounding you have to make that decision. My role as a chaplain, and frankly as leaders within the military, and I would argue leaders across the board, it's up to us to look at those with whom we serve, particularly our subordinates, and help them to become better people. Help them to figure out how they are coming to the decisions they are making. Is it just something that they did because it was a whim, or is it something that they really feel strongly about, and how do they come to a point where they can articulate that? So in this particular case, if it came to the point where he, from a religious perspective or a conscience perspective, could not continue in combat, it is not my responsibility to keep him in. That would be a moral issue. And oh, by the way, it's why the German army does no longer have chaplains in uniform. Because of World War II, in the war, the German chaplains were expected to keep people fighting for the fatherland. And that had nothing to do with religion. It had everything to do with the country. So does that answer your question? Yes, please.
So this sounds a little silly, but is an ethical decision a right decision?
Great question. So in the military, we have chaplains and we have lawyers. Let me rephrase that. We have chaplains because we have lawyers. And the lawyers think that they own ethics because they see ethics as being a right or a wrong decision. You can make a right decision, but morally, ethically, which I use sort of synonymously, it's wrong. So I would answer your question in saying no. A lawyer would answer it differently. They might ask a different question because they're lawyers. But I would say no, an ethical decision is not necessarily a yes or no. It is just like running the yellow light isn't a yes or no question, a right or wrong question. There are factors that need to be considered so that you can make it more morally right than more morally wrong. Fair enough? Okay, follow on?
So I guess the reason I was asking that is when we think about policymakers who are making decisions on things like abortion, right? It's very difficult to say what would be an ethical decision in that case or what would be a right decision. And that's what I'm confused about, how the lines are blurry between the two.
Well, because the lines are blurry. And I think that's the reason. Is there a right or wrong answer to abortion? No. Because there are so many different factors. How did she get pregnant? What are the circumstances? Are their lives in danger? What are the hygienic? What's the hygienic situation? In terms of the facilities that are available. There's a whole host of elements to that just cloud it so much that it no longer becomes a black or white decision. And I equate black or white decision with being a right or wrong decision. There are no clear lines. And so the point of this discussion really is to say, when you come to a decision that is not a right or wrong decision, how do you come to a decision without becoming paralyzed so confounded by the factors that you can't get anywhere? Okay, the woman in the pink shirt right in front of you. Hi, Maggie.
I've gleaned that ethical decision making isn't a universal process. But correct me if you think that's different. So if it's not universal, how do you personally orient yourself to the different ethical frameworks, perhaps based in culture or personal background of the people that you're working with and of their cultures?
Okay, it's not universal in this classroom. It's not universal in this country. It's not universal in you name it. Okay. So you're absolutely right. It's not universal. And the whole teleological, ontological, deontological thing proves that it's not universal. So from my perspective, and I can only speak to me, when I come into a culture, that was what I said at kind of at the beginning, I look for the places where we do connect. What can we both agree to that's right? And then at what point do we get to, at the point where we start to diverge, what's critical at that point? Are things life-changing? Are they life-threatening? And that, for me, becomes how a culture has two cultures or two divergent perspectives really have to come to a decision. You've got to find out where your points of contact are first. I think there is enough in common among us as humans. It may take a little digging. We may have to scrape a few scales off our own eyes as well as, you know, those around us. But I think there's enough in common with us as humans, the spirit that we share, that we can come to that point. But it's going to have to take a little work and some trust, too. Okay?
How about one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question?
Okay. Ooh, 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 ooh.
Thank you for coming today to speak to us.
My pleasure.
I have a two-part question. My first is, what advice would you offer to females who will be entering the service in the near future? And also, during your military experience, have you ever been placed in a situation where you've been asked to perform a task that was at odds with your own personal values, but at the same time you recognize that mission does come first?
Great question. Do you want to answer the advice to women thing? Or are you going to throw that back at me?
I'll close up. So go
okay,
ahead.
so if I don't answer the first question well enough, I know she will. My advice to anyone coming into the service, women or men, is to be true to yourself. To figure out what it is you value, what it is you hope to get out of the military. I believe, for me, the military is not, joining the military is not so that I become a better sailor, it's so that I become a better American. I become a better citizen. I become a better person. Because there's something about being on this team that requires me to better myself. We were talking a little bit about serving on a ship. If you've ever had the experience of seeing an American any ship in action, every sailor matters. The most junior, inexperienced, uneducated, unkempt, you name it, they matter. And I, as a leader, have to recognize that every person on that team matters. I don't know that I can get that anywhere else. And so I have to, A, be true to myself and my abilities, but I also have to be open to the fact that I am not in this by myself, that I have to look around to see who else is around me, bless you, and who I am working with so I can value their input. As a woman, I think what I would say is that I don't know where we get it, but I think there's an uber meekness that some women adopt, an extra meekness that women adopt. And I don't know what that's about. I don't know because I also have it and have had it. There's an element of, I'm just not good enough. Well, darn it, you are, all right? And as a woman, wherever you are serving, you are, whether it's in uniform or not in uniform, whether it's in business or whether it's in the home, you are good enough. And you have gifts and graces, to use my vernacular. You have abilities that only you have. And that you have to own those and value those. Now you're going to get the preacher out of me here, okay? So I'll slow down some. And your second question was, what do I do? Oh, what have I ever come to a position where I have been counter to my own? You know, this is where I'm very, very fortunate. As a chaplain, I have very particular faith parameters. And I will never be obligated to go beyond those faith parameters to the point where I have to contradict them or compromise them. Never. That is a privilege I, as a Navy chaplain, have. And so, for me, my foundation, my decision-making, my plumb line, if you will, is a spiritual plumb line. It's from the foundation of my faith. And people respect that. And so, therefore, I'm never asked to go beyond that. But I do believe I'm in a privileged position in that way. I think there are military members who also have just as strong a framework and just a strong foundational principles, faith principles, that do not enjoy the privilege that I have because I have a cross on my sleeve, which indicates that I'm a chaplain. And so they will have to come to a point where they are going to have a discussion with themselves, with the people they value, with their mentors, with their leaders, and it may come to a point where it's just not a fit, and then they would have to leave the military. Okay?
So you can see why I wanted Margaret to come here today. If you would give her a round of applause, because I've made errors with Margaret a couple of times. First of all, she baptized my niece a long, long time ago, actually about 21 years ago. And
I was 12.
Yeah, and she's been a great, spiritual advisor to me. Now that's Margaret to Ann and Reverend Kibben to Ann Rondeau. We both have the same faith traditions, but she's junior to me in the military, and yet I could go to her with great faith and trust that I could go to her as my chaplain and not as the junior officer and ask her for spiritual advice. So she was a spiritual mentor to me as well. She's also come up through the ranks, and you can see why. The fact that she's the first woman chaplain for the Marine Corps is pretty phenomenal, but she did other things with the Marines before that to prove her pedigree and her proficiency in the culture of the Marines. So what you have standing in front of you is not only a faith leader, but a military leader who knew how to make things work and how to make things happen and how to translate and interpret meaning so that the line commander could understand some of the dilemmas of his or her soldier, sailor, marine, or airman. This is tremendously important for a leader. How can I interpret and translate what my people need to a more senior person so that we can get things done? That translation skill and that interpretation talent is really important for a leader. To get back to the question about women and about the dilemmas of making kind of the toss-up as to which moral question, ethical question is greater, Margaret's comment is right about her official role as a chaplain. I've known many a chaplain who has stood on principle of his or her faith, and they are protected in doing that, and they are allowed to actually disobey an order based upon that, and they have. I've had them do that, and so, but what happens there is that I just don't go off and storm off and get mad because I'm the line commander, and a chaplain has said I can't do that. What I have done, and again, this is an aspect of leadership, is let's engage in the conversation so that I understand. And why is it? And what is your reasoning in that? And what is my reasoning back? And if I am respectful of that role of the chaplain, and I am, if I am respectful of also the dynamic, that maybe there is a better answer here, then in the end, we're going to come up with actually probably a pretty good answer. So this is disobedience on principle, which as a leader I should be able to not be afraid of, and I should be able to understand. That still, though, comes to your needing to make a decision. And the word that Margaret would be implying in any of this is judgment. At some point, your judgment is required. And it is the exquisite judgment that many a person in the military has to make. Not only about 10 to 30%, depending upon how and when you look at it, of our people fight wars. All the rest are doing other things that are in support, and everything from medical to chaplains to the people who pay the bills and everything else. But that 10 or 30% have got extraordinary judgments to make every day. So, and they can choose the good from the bad, those are the easy ones. But the good from the less good, or the good from the more good, well, what is strategically important at that point? So famously, I don't remember the division. It was an Army Airborne Division. Famously, when they first went into Iraq, it was Iraq or Afghanistan. An Army unit was going in toward a mosque. If you remember this story, was going in toward a mosque because there was a report that there was a disturbance at the mosque and that this might go against U.S. forces, and he brings his unit up, and they're all armed and they're all cocked and loaded and they're all ready for combat and everything else. And he begins to see what's swirling. So he is going there with a mission to protect and to prevent. Okay? So the larger objective is to protect allies, to prevent violence. He goes in there and he's ready to do that with violence if he has to, okay? So he is ready to take his unit and do what he has to do to protect and to prevent. As he's going in, the locals are beginning to swirl around because they're heading to a mosque. They're heading to a sacred place, and they're beginning to swirl around him. And he made an immediate decision that protection and prevention could first be done by submission. And so he makes all of his unit get down on one knee and bring their rifle down so that it was in the dirt and it quelled the entire event. He made some judgments at that point about what was going to happen and not what was happening. He anticipated the moral dilemma. He anticipated the ethical problem that was ahead of him, as well as the tactical issue. But he made a judgment based upon instincts and based upon training and education. He understood the Muslim religion. He understood the Iraqi culture. This man studied the history of Babylon and the Tigris and Euphrates before going, and he understood what his empowerment was to make a decision. We were all asked to do that, man, woman, or anything else. So judgment is really important. Would you say anything about that?
I agree.
Okay, this has been a pleasure for us. The good Dr. Murray always has to pull us off. But we are delighted to have been here and to be a part of this event. And again, I brought one of the best leaders in our Navy Marine Corps team today, and somebody who, as a Princeton Theological Seminary graduate, this is a great little thing about Margaret. When she was a lieutenant commander, I think, or lieutenant, Princeton Theological had given her really high grades for her ability to give sermons. Can you figure that out? And the Navy Chaplain Corps had her do a series of these and ship them out at that time on tape to all of the chaplains and said, "This is how you preach." Thanks.
So for those of you who had the wonderful judgment to sign up for the tea this afternoon,